Chapter 2, Studying Social Life, Sociological Research Methods. Overview of research methods. Quantitative research translates the social world into numbers that can be studied mathematically. Qualitative research uses non-numerical data like text, interviews, photos, and recordings to help us understand social life. It is important to note that within the social sciences, both of these types of research are valuable. Some researchers specialize in one type of research or the other, but many use both methods to triangulate their data, or to make sure that their findings are consistent no matter what kind of research they do. A good example of quantitative research is the U.S. Census, which uses surveys to analyze data from across the country. A good example of qualitative research is Anne Frank's diary, which provides field notes based on her experiences and observations. The scientific approach. The scientific method is a procedure for acquiring knowledge that emphasizes collecting data through observation and experiment. You may hear about the scientific method in your natural science classes like biology or chemistry. This is the same procedure that social scientists often employ, although natural scientists and social scientists study different things. Both disciplines are scientific in that they collect data to analyze and understand the topic that interests them. Steps of the scientific method. Number 1. Identify a problem or ask a question. Number 2. Conduct a literature review. Number 3. Form a hypothesis. Give operational definitions to variables. 4. Choose a research design or method. 5. Collect data. 6. Analyze data. 7. Disseminate findings. The scientific method includes literature review, hypotheses, variables, operational definitions. Research can lead to what Thomas Kuhn called a paradigm shift, or a change in the way we think about some aspect of life. Literature review, when embarking on a research project, it is important to determine what research has already been done. You don't want to spend hours, weeks, or even months replicating someone else's projects, so you conduct a literature review. Hypothesis. You formulate your hypothesis or come up with a scientific guess about what it is that you expect to find. Variables. You determine what variables you want to study. For instance, if you want to look at test scores among 5th graders to see if eating breakfast improves performance, you have 2 variables: 5th graders taking a test and breakfast. Operationalize. Then you have to operationalize your definitions. For example, what is breakfast? Bacon and eggs, a piece of toast, a piece of candy. Operational definitions allow you to be more specific in examining your findings. Paradigm shift example. For instance, we used to believe that the world was flat, but new research gave us evidence that the world was actually not flat. That research led us to a paradigm shift in our thinking about the world. The scientific method continued. The scientific method helps to determine and distinguish between correlation, causation, and spurious causation. Correlation, a relationship between 2 variables. Causation, a relationship in one variable causes another variable to change. Spurious correlation, a relationship that seems to exist between 2 variables, but is actually caused by some external or intervening variable. Let's take an example. In Florida, there are a lot of palm trees and a lot of senior citizens. You want to examine the relationship between the variables. The variables in this case are palm trees and senior citizens. You see that in states with fewer palm trees, there are fewer senior citizens. And in Florida, where there are many palm trees, there are many senior citizens. Therefore, there is a relationship between the variables. Palm trees and senior citizens are correlated. Now, you want to see if there are any causations. Do palm trees cause senior citizens? Well, you can conduct an experiment where you plant 100,000 palm trees in Ohio and monitor the population. Suppose you see no change in the number of senior citizens. In that case, you can tell the palm trees aren't causing senior citizens. So what's going on? There is a relationship, but it is not causal. You start to investigate further, and then you realize that palm trees like warm weather. Senior citizens also like warm weather. There is a third variable, temperature, that you didn't think of at the beginning. This is a spurious correlation. There is a relationship between palm trees and senior citizens, but it is based on the fact that they both have a relationship with a third variable, temperature. Which method to use? There are different ways to collect information about a topic, but each method has benefits and limitations. When beginning a research project, it is important to consider which method will work best. Sometimes researchers will collect data using more than one method. This is called a mixed methods approach. If your research shows the same trends when you use multiple kinds of methods, it increases the likelihood that your conclusions are correct. Ethnography, participant observation. One way to collect data is through ethnography, studying people in their own environments in order to understand the meanings they give to their activities. In participant observation, the researcher both observes and becomes in a social setting. Participation observation example. Say, for instance, you want to study a particular church. One of the best ways to study that church might be to conduct an ethnographic study, where you go to that church for the services and participate in church activities. In a sense, this gives you a bird's eye view into the inner workings of that organization. It is usually required that you inform the organization that you will be collecting data while you are there. Ethnography literally means writing culture, which happens when researchers collect their observations and write about their experiences in a scientific way. Ethnography and participant observation continued. Ethnography usually happens in two steps. The researcher participates in and observes a setting. Then the researcher makes a written account, field notes, of what goes on there. Ethnographers aim to provide a thick description of the setting they observe. It is important to take thorough and precise field notes when conducting an ethnographic study. Leaving something out because it doesn't seem important to you can result in incomplete data. Every detail is equally important, and recording these details properly allows the researcher to draw conclusions at the end of the study. Thus, writing field notes can be very time-consuming. Interviews. Interviews involve direct, face-to-face contact with respondents. They can generate large amounts of qualitative data. A researcher identifies the target population of interest and then selects a sample of people to be interviewed from that population. Interviews can take a long time to complete, but they can produce very rich data. In fact, in an interview, a respondent might say something that the researcher had not previously considered, which can help focus the research project. Researchers have to be careful not to lead the respondent into certain kinds of answers by asking questions like, "You really like eating vegetables, don't you?" Instead, researchers should allow the respondent to answer freely by asking questions like, "How do you feel about eating vegetables?" Interviews continued. Interviews can use open-ended questions or closed-ended questions. Open-ended questions let respondents talk as much as they'd like about the question you asked, whereas closed-ended questions give respondents a choice of answers. An open-ended question allows the answer to take whatever form the respondent chooses. An example is, "What do you think about couples living together before they are married?" The respondent can give lots of information, examples, and personal experiences, all of which could provide valuable data to the researcher. This method does take a lot of time, though, as responses can be lengthy. A closed-ended question imposes a limit on the possible responses. For example, "Are you for or against couples living together before they are married?" this question doesn't have an option for a middle ground. Respondents are forced to choose either yes or no. Surveys. Surveys are questionnaires that are administered to a sample of respondents selected from a target population. Sociologists often use probability sampling to obtain a sample that reflects the characteristics of members of the target population. Survey research tends to look at large-scale social patterns and employs statistics and other mathematical means of analysis. Surveys are relatively easy to create and to administer. However, they are generally closed-ended. You can't have a dialogue with a respondent in a survey. Therefore, answers will be direct and usually concise. It is easy to collect a lot of data this way, but the scope of the responses will be limited. Existing sources. Existing sources refer to any data that has already been collected by earlier researchers and is available for future research. Utilizing existing sources is an unobtrusive measure that does not disturb the setting or subjects under study. Existing sources can include census data, newspapers, photography, and cultural artifacts. Using existing data is usually less involved than collecting original data and also gives researchers access to distant places and times. Unobtrusive measures limit reactivity, the tendency of people and events to react to the process of being studied. Reactivity can lead to the Hawthorne effect, where an outcome results from the research setting rather than the independent variable instrument of interest. Experimental methods. Experiments are formal tests of specific variables and effects that are performed in a setting where all aspects of the situation can be controlled. Experiments are sometimes difficult to conduct in social settings because it is hard to control every aspect of a social situation. But they can provide valuable insight into how a person might respond if experimental methods continued. Many experiments involve an experimental group, participants that receive the experimental treatment or intervention. A control group, participants that continue without interventions so they can be compared with the experimental group. This method is very common in medicine, where one group, the experimental group, receives a drug treatment and another group, the control group, receives a placebo, or a treatment that looks like that given to the experimental group, but actually has no effect. For instance, this group might get a pill that looks like the experimental pill, but is really just a sugar pill, so it will have no effect on the participant's health. However, this method is also used in social science to collect data. Non-academic uses of research methods. The research methods described in this chapter are often applied outside the field of sociology. Example, U.S. Census, political campaign offices, business, and market research. Value-free sociology. Most sociologists believe that they should not allow their personal beliefs to influence their research. Max Weber coined the phrase value-free sociology, stating that researchers should identify facts without allowing their own personal beliefs or biases to interfere. Value-free sociology is helpful because if you try to conduct a study and you think you already know what you're going to find, those suspicions might make you see what you're looking for and ignore other important facts. Conducting sociological research. The American Sociological Association has developed its own code of ethics to help researchers avoid bias and adhere to professional standards and to protect respondents from harm. It is always important to consider the outcome of your study. If you administer a drug, is there a possibility that someone could die? If you ask questions about sensitive childhood memories, will the respondent have a traumatic experience answering them? Adhering to the code of ethics helps you to avoid situations that could potentially harm your respondents or yourself. Conducting sociological research continued. Most universities where research is conducted also have an Institutional Review Board, IRB. An IRB is a group of scholars within a university that reviews and approves their colleagues' research proposals and makes recommendations for how to protect human subjects. Anytime you are conducting research, it is helpful to have input from other scholars. It helps ensure your research is sound, no one gets harmed, and you're embarking on a project that will contribute to the existing literature and that other scholars will appreciate.